Hello and welcome back to the Urban Elements Studio. Today's video is primarily geared to somebody who's just gotten a long arm machine or somebody who is just starting out doing pantographs. I'm going to pull you in a little bit closer so you can see two different pantographs on the table here, and then I'm going to take one of them over. I have a small quilt sample loaded on the long arm, and I'm going to load the paper pantograph on the back of the long arm, and I'm going to show you how to do the first part of the design, which is going to be at the very top of the quilt, which will be a partial, and then the first full design. And because people often wonder how to get that first partial design at the very top, and this will also be the same technique that you would repeat at the bottom, because a quilt is never going to be the exact size to have a complete series of panto rows at the bottom. So you're always going to have to do some kind of a partial row at the bottom, and I'm going to show you how that technique works. It will be the same but at the bottom as we do at the top. In this particular one, I've cut off the end of the design and paper on the panto, but gives you the name of the design, the height of the design, which is this, not this, and it tells you if it's a single row or double row. This has two rows, so you would sew one and then you could come back and sew the other before you have to roll up the quilt. And it says 144 inches long. That's how long the whole roll is. Now the size of this design here that we're looking at is just a miniature, just so you can see what the design looks like, but this is not the size of the design itself. The size of the design itself is here. This is just to make it easy for you to find when you're looking through all of your pantographs. So you'll notice that all of our pantographs this has a double row, as we said, here and here, but it also has this partial echo here and this partial echo here. It's always going to have them on both sides, so no matter which way you load this on the machine, it's going to have it at both ends. There's no right or wrong way. You can load it this way or this way. It's not going to matter. The only time it would matter is if this was a directional panto, in the case of writing or something like that. We have pantos that say happy birthday. Obviously you'd want the writing to be right side up and then it would matter. But something like this, it wouldn't. And today I'm going to show you how to use this partial part here is where we're going to start the panto at. So this will be my first full row, but I'm going to use this echo as my partial row to fill in the very top of the quilt. When we would get to the bottom of the quilt, we would also use this portion here to finish off the quilt as well. And I'm just going to show you on another one. This is the particular one. I didn't cut off that end piece, but you can see the name of this one's Pirouette. This is a much taller design. It's 11 3/4 inches high, but again, they're all 144 inches long, and it is a single row this time, and this one was designed by Patricia Ritter. So you can see there's only one pass on this one, so you just do it once and then you'll have to roll it up. But again, there's an echo at both ends, and it wouldn't matter which way you loaded the paper on the machine. So I'm going to go ahead and load this one, and I'll show you how I load it and do the starting partial row. This is my quilt top, the green portion. I have my batting here. My batting extends all the way out to the size of my backing. And I do that so that when the quilt rolls up, that this part doesn't become slack. And I know that that wastes a little bit of batting, but I'd rather the quilt be tight on the sides than be loose. And I've also basted the edges and the top of the quilt sandwich so that my hopping foot cannot get underneath the edge of that quilt top, because that can cause a real big problem if you sew on and off the quilt, especially when you're behind the quilt and you can't see. So now we're going to move to the back of the quilt and show you how I loaded the paper. Pantograph grids is this grid that I have on the back of my long arm machine. This is a one-time purchase. This is a plastic sheeting that goes on the table. It has a grid on it in 1-inch increments, but it's also marked in 1/4 inch. It has a 0 mark here, and then it goes out in higher numbers in both directions, and you would cut it off on both ends to fit your table. But what this does is it protects your pantograph, and it also allows you to make editing marks on the plastic without marking on your pantograph itself. It also protects it if you are drinking coffee or wine and you happen to spill it. But I have slipped my paper pantograph underneath the plastic, and I have it lined up. So the head of my machine, where the needle is right at the edge of the quilt, and I can see that the laser light is shining right here on 29 inches. So that is going to be the start of my quilt. And so I've moved the very beginning of the design right to the 29-inch mark. And if I bring the needle all the way to the bottom or the top of the quilt, I can see here that the very beginning of the quilt is the very, very edge of the plastic pantograph grids, right at the very edge where the echo design starts. So in this case, I really don't have to do any editing. All I have to do is sew these echo parts, and I don't even have to tie off or anything. I can just, when I go off, I can just go down to the next one and continue all the way down until I get to the end. Then I can just come back to my start point and do the first full row. But also I'm going to show you, I have the needle here at this edge, and I have the line here at the 1/6 inch mark, so I will make a mark at the 1/6 inch to know where I'm going to stop sewing. And we would do this with some kind of a marker, and our two choices for this, most people would use either a dry erase marker or a wet erase marker. And I would advise against using a dry erase marker in the quilting studio, because we're working with quilts which are fabric, and we use fabric to erase the markings on the grid, which means that if the quilt accidentally touched anywhere on the grid, maybe when we were taking the quilt off of the frame and it touched that marking, it would get that stain on the quilt. So you don't want that transfer to happen because you've used a dry erase marker. If you use a wet erase marker, these can only be erased when you get them wet, and so you're not as likely to transfer ink onto your quilt just by taking it off the frame. So I like to use the wet erase markers, and I hope one of these is working. But I would just go down and I mark a line where I'm going to finish, and where the design may go on and off the quilt, I would just make some editing marks. So that I can do continuous sewing. And finish the quilt in one pass without having to sew on and off the quilt. And this is how I would finish. And this would work every single time I roll up the quilt. I wouldn't have to re-edit it every single time. But you would have to do this every time you load a new panto. But as soon as you're done with the whole quilt, you could just use a wet paper towel and erase this. But now I'm going to go ahead and do my echo first. And I can put you up front and let you watch that sew out. But, well, I'll do part of it back here, and then I'll let you see the other part up front. You should be able to see my laser dot right here, and I'm going to be sewing this portion of the design, which is the bottom echo. been a while since I've sewn back here. I have my red laser light dot right at the very beginning of the design. I didn't have to make any editing marks here because I can get it to the design to start right at the very edge of my quilt. And notice that I have the design loaded so that I start and I'm going to sew left to right. I did that because most people are comfortable doing that because we've learned to read left to right. If you're more comfortable sewing right to left, that's perfectly fine. You would just turn the panto the other way. I'm going to sew this from this side until I go out of the camera view, and then I'll just find a place to stop and I'll move you to the front, and then you can see my poor panto sewing. So the echo at the top and bottom, we've just demonstrated just one of the ways that can be used. And that is to start the quilt off at the top and to end the quilt off at the bottom when the full rows of pantos won't do. And also I will say, I haven't done free motion pantos in a while. Also, I would never do black thread on a light quilt if I were actually quilting. I always use very low contrast thread. But I do recommend, if you're going to practice, that you practice on a scrap fabric like I did today. So that is what I'm going to show today. Until next time, I'm going to show something else on the pantos. But until next time, take care of yourself and take care of each other. bye.